All right. Thank you all for attending our TCSS 2023 virtual portion of the conference. Tonight we have Dory Gerber presenting from Institute Curriculum Services, and she's got her session Jewish Immigration to America 1880 to 1924. I've had a chance to hear Dory speak multiple times at various venues, actually. So hopefully you all will enjoy this. And if you got anything in the chat, I will be sure to monitor it. If not, the floor is yours.
Thank you,
Or
Dr.
screen, I
Ken.
guess now.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Ken. I really appreciate that. That very warm welcome. Welcome to everyone who has joined us this evening. I think it speaks so highly of educators who, after a long day of teaching, hop on a virtual Zoom. So thanks so much for being here, and I hope you find this a good use of your time. And let's get into Jewish Immigration to America, 1880 to 1924. Like Dr. Ken has said, my name is Dory Gerber, and I'm an educator with the Institute for Curriculum Services. Just to give you a little bit of a background of who we are and what we do, if this is your first time joining a PD with us, we're a nonprofit education initiative. We're based in San Francisco, California. As a regional educator, I'm actually Zooming in from Orlando, Florida, and I hope that maybe I can make it back to Tennessee in person for an upcoming conference. That would be amazing. But our mission is to improve the quality on topics related to Jews, Judaism, and Jewish history in the United States. And what we do is we develop standards-aligned curricula and provide free professional development, and our curricula is free as well, to support teachers when these topics come across your state standards. They are all rooted in primary sources. You can see we're a consortium member of the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources program. We went through a very rigorous application process to receive that distinction. And it really highlights our commitment as an organization to ensure that all that we offer to support your instruction are rooted in primary sources so students can think critically and independently when making meaning about historical and current events. Ultimately, we believe that an excellent education is what is essential to building a strong civil society where all people can flourish. And the graphic that you see here shows the variety of topics that we offer through our free resources and professional development. The blue being kind of the subhead in the social studies umbrella, with the maroon being the specific topics themselves. So if any of these topics are ones that come across your standards, please check out our website and find resources that can support you on that. Also, really quickly, we have through the end of March, a self-paced online course regarding the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict through primary sources. And so if this is a topic that you are looking to learn a little bit more about, this is an in-depth learning experience that will provide you information from experts in the field, a variety of primary sources and secondary sources, maps, videos, so on and so forth. So it's a really great opportunity to participate and to deepen that content knowledge on that topic. You can earn 10 hours of participation credit. It should take no more than 10 hours to complete. The link to sign up for that is in the chat box. And if you have not had a chance to sign in for today's session, if you could please just grab either the QR code that you see there or the attendance link in the chat box, I would greatly appreciate that as well. All right, we will kick off this session by doing a high-level overview of Jewish immigration to America. So when did Jews begin to arrive to this country, and where did they go? Then with that baseline understanding, what we will do is look more closely at the time period between 1880 and 1924. We'll look at the way America was being portrayed to immigrants and the various push and pull factors that affected immigration. And then from there, we'll look at what life was like for Jewish immigrants. And finally, we'll find out what caused the sudden and dramatic decrease of Jewish immigration to the United States in 1924. And as with all ICS workshops, you will leave this evening's session with a link to a collection of resources, a very robust collection of resources to support your instruction on this topic. So what I want to do is just start off with a little trivia, okay? So I'm going to put a link to a Mentimeter in the chat box. So if you could grab this link, you can do it a variety of ways. You could go to menti.com, enter that code. You could use your QR code there on the screen, or you can grab the link I just put in the chat box. So give everyone just a few seconds to enter the Mentimeter, and then I'll go ahead and do our little trivia and see what we all kind of already know about this time period of history. So we'll wait for a few more of you to enter, and then we will get started on our just a 3-question survey or quiz. Okay. And if you don't use Mentimeter in your classroom, I hope you'll find this a new and fun tool for interactive learning. There's a variety of different templates what I'll be using. And check it out. It's free. It's a really awesome platform for student engagement and interaction. All right, here we are. Are you ready for question 1? Here we go. Here come your responses or answer choices. All right. So when do you think Jews first arrived in North America? The majority of you said the 1600s, and you were correct. Let's take a look at the leaderboard. Awesome. You know, a little healthy competition never hurt anyone, right? Next question. Here we go. Where do you think the first Jewish immigrants to the United States came from? Spain, Portugal, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, or Russia? Okay, that one kind of stumped a good portion of you, but those of you who chose Spain and Portugal, you are correct. Let's see where the leaderboard stands now. Hey, Reed, you got a slight lead over Will. Frosty, you're not far behind. All right, here we go. Last question. And you'll see we'll touch more on these questions through our conversation this evening. Which famous American was of Jewish descent? Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, Emma Lazarus, Clara Barton. This also had you guys divided a little bit, but the right answer was Emma Lazarus. Let's see who claims the leader of this quick little Tennessee Council for the Social Studies game for tonight. Will, way to go. Great job. All right, so thanks for participating. Hopefully that got you thinking a little bit about our conversation. Just want to highlight to you the slide that you see here is showing an activity that you could do with your students to have them investigate their immigration stories, allowing for an opportunity for them to really investigate their personal pasts. And also, you know, research does show that relevant and meaningful activities that both engage students emotionally and connect with what they already know really helps to build neural connections and long-term memory storage. Not to mention doing an activity like this really helps to establish an inclusive and supportive classroom community. So getting into the data here, it shows that immigrants have come to the United States throughout history from many different places for many different reasons. So according to the Pew Research Center, in 2018, immigrants made up 13.7% of the population here in the United States. That more than doubled the amount of of immigrant individuals that made up the population of the United States in 1960, and that was 5.4%. So in this lesson, we're going to dive into a particular group's immigration story at a specific moment in time, right? The Jewish people in the early 20th century. But by learning about this group's immigration story, we can then better understand the larger story of immigration and the contributions of immigrants to this country. So many of you actually did guess that Jews were present in America prior to the big wave of immigration in the 1800s. I would say pre-America, right? So the Jewish immigration story actually began back in 1654 with the arrival of Sephardic Jews who are Jews of Spanish or Portuguese descent. So at the time, these Jews were fleeing Portuguese expulsion and Inquisition. Many went to Brazil, but the Inquisition was actually active in Brazil. So many did continue their flight to North America. And then for the next several decades, the American Jewish community was really predominantly Sephardic. However, the Jews that arrived in large numbers between 1880 and 1924, and likely the group that you're most familiar with, were Jews of Ashkenazi descent, Jews that came from Central or Eastern Europe, coming from places like Germany, parts of or Russia, Austria-Hungary, Romania, so on and so forth. Now, the map that you see here is to help you visualize where many of Europe's Ashkenazi Jews immigrated to, right? Their countries of origin and their United States destination. Now, keep in mind that the width of the arrow denotes the largest number of immigrants. So as you can see on the map, right, the biggest group of immigrants came to America and they settled in many large American cities, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, to name a few. So I want to zoom in a little closer on this particular period of American history by looking at a primary source. So the chart that you see here depicts the average of total Jewish immigration globally in relation to Jewish immigration to the United States from 1840 to 1942. Now, each person or each figure on the graph is representing 5,000 immigrants. The filled in figures represent Jewish immigrants to the United States, while the unfilled figures represent Jewish immigrants that went to other countries. We'll look at this on the next slide in a bit of a more enlarged fashion and give you a few moments to ponder these questions, right? What do you notice about the immigration numbers over time? And what do you think caused these fluctuations? Okay, so I'm going to give you a moment or so just to take an eye walk, really make some observations. And as you're making those observations, think about what are you noticing about the immigration numbers over time? And what do you think would be causing those fluctuations? Give you about a moment, a minute or so to just take that all in. And whenever you're ready, if you would like to share an observation in the chat box, please do so. Okay, take about another 20 seconds or so to look over this chart, this diagram in a little more detail. So, okay, thank you for sharing that. So my question was going to be, what do you notice about the immigration numbers over time? So Lauren is saying that there was a steep drop after 1925. Was this due to the National Origins Act, right? Josh is noticing that it began to shrink a bit, that there was a peak in the early 20th century, says Dylan. Will says there are periods of heavy immigration tied to various world events and shrinkage in times of heavy anti-Semitism. Amazing. So going back and building on what Will said here, what's happening in history during 1915, 1920? If you're thinking World War I, you're correct, right? A huge drop in immigration would be understandable given that the world is at war, right? So, right, Marcus, pre-World War I would be a lot larger in numbers because there was no threat or time of war at that time, right? And then if we look down here, 1936 to 1942, yep, you got it, Will. There's a lot of that. And we're going to talk about those pogroms as one of the push factors for Eastern European Jews leaving Russia, right? So we know that during this time, we're dealing with World War II, and that what we know, right, is that some Jews at this period of time were able to make it out of Europe, but 6 million did perish during the Holocaust. Nope, you did a great job with that, Will. And then we know something clearly happened between that time period of 1926 to 1930. We'll wonder maybe if, let me go back up here, if Lauren's question about the National Origins Act is correct. We'll revisit that in a little bit. Thank you so much for all of your participation. I love that. So one of the most famous primary sources that highlights America as a desirable destination for immigrants is the poem The New Colossus, which is a cultural icon I'm sure that we are all familiar with. Now, the poem was written by Emma Lazarus. She was one of our trivia question answers, right? She was a Sephardic Jewish woman living in the United States. She was a passionate immigration activist. She wrote this poem to help raise funds for the construction of the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, where her words would eventually become immortalized. So this is an excerpt from that poem. Take a moment to read it over. And while you're reading it over, consider these questions and go ahead, just like we did before, add your thoughts to the chat box. What is the tone of this poem? And how is Emma portraying America's role on the world stage, right? So how is America being portrayed to the world at this time, 1883? And what is the tone of this poem, of this excerpt for sure? Go ahead and give your feedback in the chat box after you've reviewed that section. Okay, interesting. Will is saying that the tone is weary and hopeful at the same time, right? America is seen as the golden land, a place of success, a rest for those who are really weary. Lauren, America is portrayed as a welcoming place to all who face hardship. Yeah, it's giving the idea of great hope, right? It's hopeful. The statue is beckoning and welcoming. It's a motherly a figure, right? That America is this protector, this welcomer of others. Yeah, absolutely. A safe place. Now, if you're going to discuss, or you already do discuss and analyze the New Colossus with your students, our lesson plan includes this poem along with some guiding questions, as well as this unique recording of the poem that is sung with music that was actually written by composer Irving Berlin, who he himself was a Jewish immigrant. And when you listen to that recording, which music is an excellent primary source in and of itself, it really allows for the tone to come through in such a different way than if you yourself just read this aloud to your students or they themselves read it. So I highly encourage you taking a listen to that from the session's resources. Okay. Now, another popular term that's used to describe American society is often the melting pot, right? Immediately, I go back to the Schoolhouse Rock's The Great American Melting Pot runs through my mind. But the term was actually coined by Israel Zangwill. He was the son of Jewish immigrants as well as a British author. And in 1908, he wrote a play called The Melting Pot. The play was about a Russian Jewish immigrant who comes to America after fleeing the violence in Eastern Europe. So those are the pogroms that you were talking about, Will. So on the screen is an excerpt from the play where the term melting pot is actually first used. So let's read this excerpt. And while I read this particular excerpt aloud, I want you to be thinking about, again, what does Israel's dialogue, right, in addition to Emma's poem, really tell us about how immigration was thought of in the late 19th and early 20th century. So he says in this excerpt from the play, understand that America is God's crucible, the melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Here you stand, good folk, think I, when I see them at Ellis Island. Here you stand in your 50 groups, your 50 languages and histories, and your 50 blood hatreds and rivalries. But you won't be like that for long, brothers, for these are the fires of God you've come to. Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen and Englishmen, Jews and Russians, into the crucible with you all. God is making me American. So what is he saying here in his poem? What is he saying? That what is America offering that maybe individuals in other countries are not able to find? Okay. Will saying, but by people who saw immigration as a benefit, immigration was seen as a cleansing of sorts, a place where people can be reimagined, reborn, right? Free of any sort of ethnic divisions, right? Free of racial amalgamation, right? Yeah, a new beginning, this idealized, cohesive society, right? Why would America be so encouraging these types of messages? Okay, tones of assimilation, no longer your language's history, but this becoming anew, this America, right? And the pros and cons of assimilation, right? So quickly though, my question to you is, what's happening in America that the American government would encourage these types of messages? Israel's play and Emma's poem. Why would America want this influx of immigrants? Why would it be portrayed so welcoming? There you go, Will. 20th century industrialization, the need for workers, right? Okay. So there's somewhat of a motive taking place here. Yeah, there you go. So now that we have some context for this time period, I want to unpack what was happening in Europe that either forced or encouraged Jewish people to leave, and what was happening in America that made Jewish people want to come. And the two terms that we are familiar with that use to understand immigration are push and pull, right? And so these are good to review with your students. Push being factors that encourage or push out a population to leave their home. And then pull factors are the things that are drawing a population into another area or place. So let's talk about the push factors that spurred Jews to leave their home countries. So first and foremost, anti-Semitism. Will, you touched on this, right? Throughout Eastern Europe, Jews faced laws and practices that really limited their lives. Now, they were not restricted in how they could practice their religion, but they were restricted in many other aspects of their lives because they were Jewish, right? Keep in mind, sometimes it's difficult to understand what is a Jew. What is, right? Judaism is the monotheistic religion of the Jewish people, but not all Jews practice the religion. So some Jews are ethnically or identify culturally as Jewish. So the restrictions weren't necessarily, they were more political and economic at this time rather than religious, right? And so some of the things that they were facing in Eastern Europe at this time was that, you know, restrictions on where they could live, jobs they could have, where they could go to school, their participation, if any, in politics, whether they could own land, even change their names, okay, are things that they were facing legal restrictions on. Then there was intense violence. Okay, so Eastern European Jews were victims of pogroms, which were waves of mob violence against Jewish people and their property. This is what Israel wrote his play, The Melting Pot, about, right? And major pogroms, 1881 and 1903, were encouraged by the Russian government due to the really poor living conditions for all Russians at the time. And so Jews were seen essentially as scapegoats for that. Many Jews in Eastern Europe faced great poverty. Industrialization across Europe made it harder for Jewish artisans to make a living. And that's really what most Jews were able to do. They were able to do portable jobs, right? Peddlers, merchants, you know, things that were portable, as I was saying. Now, rigid class structure made it hard to gain wealth or status if you weren't born with it. And political systems gave a much greater voice to those who were already powerful and wealthy. And then, of course, the turn of the 20th century was a time of great political upheaval across Europe. And many European Jews, Eastern European Jews specifically, feared that these rapid political changes and conflicts and wars might make it unsafe for them and their family. And as we know, with the Holocaust, those predictions were absolutely correct. Now, let's talk about the pull factors. What was happening in America that might make Jewish people want to come? So family and friends were already in the United States. Jewish immigrants in the United States sent letters home encouraging loved ones to join them. I think it was Will or someone else mentioned about America being viewed as the golden land, right? The Goldene Medina is what it was referred to in Yiddish, right? In these letters and in these advertisements that were being sent back home, painting the United States as this place of wealth and ease and plenty. And then, of course, there was the idea of social mobility, the hope that in the United States, these individuals and their families could achieve greater wealth, greater education, professional status, and then that their rights and freedoms would be protected by the United States government, that they would have equal rights under the law and in society, which they were denied in their countries of origin. Now, this postcard that you see is a primary source. It was created for the Jewish New Year called Rosh Hashanah, and it was printed between the years of 1900 and 1920, specifically being sent back to families in Russia. And you can see it depicting Jewish Americans there on the left, if you see, welcoming Jewish immigrants from Russia there on the right. And it features many of the push and pull factors for immigration to the United States. So I ask you just to eye walk over this image and tell me in the chat box, what do you notice about it? What stands out at you? What are some things that when you see it are like, huh, this is super interesting? Share your thoughts in the chat box. The clothing, there's definitely a difference in the clothing, right, Karen? The ones on the right, those Jewish immigrants from Russia, are definitely dressed a lot plainer. much more modest, right? And even the coloring that the artist used, very muted colors, were the clothing of those on the left, those American Jews that have immigrated, much brighter. They're red, white, and blue. They're more Americanized. They might have men both having beards, but the beards are very different, right? Taylor says he sees the words Happy New Year on the postcard with Hebrew next to it, right? The birds, one seems to depict royalty and the other does not. That's interesting. They actually are eagles or birds holding the crests of America and of Russia. And in the banner underneath the American eagle is Hebrew from the book of Psalms, and it says, "Shelter us in the shadow of your wings." The body language, right? The American Jews are upright and hopeful. The Russian Jews depict as tired, fleeing, with their worldly possessions. There are those bags, absolutely. I don't know if anyone else noticed this, and I'll move on from this image, but again, I do, this is part of our collection of resources, and I hope that you'll use this with your students. But when I look at this, I have this image immediately of Moses and the parting of the Red Sea, almost as if the ones on the American Jews on the left are kind of welcoming the Russian immigrants to the promised land, right? That the parting of the sea is what is allowing them to freedom, if you will. Okay, thank you so much for all of your participation. Marcus, they definitely seem happier. I agree with you. Now, this is an example of an activity about push and pull factors that you can do with your students for a bit of an annotation activity. And it's an excerpt that is written, that was written as an article and published back in 1898 in the Atlantic magazine. It was written by a gentleman named Abraham Kahan, who was the first editor of a major Yiddish newspaper called The Forward. The Forward is actually still printed today. It is not printed in Yiddish anymore. But using this excerpt, you can have your students annotate it to identify the push and pull factors for these Russian Jews. So let's take a moment to review this excerpt from the article. Again, this was intended to be written to Russian Jews back in 1898. And it says, "There's no hope for Israel," Israel being a synonym for Jews at the time. It is no longer a synonym for Jews. It's an antiquated term. So there is no hope for Israel in Russia. The salvation of the downtrodden people lies in other parts, in a land beyond the seas, which knows no distinction of race or faith, which is a mother to Jew and Gentile alike. And the great republic is our redemption from the brutalities and ignominies to which we are subjected in this, our birthplace. In America, we shall find rest. The stars and stripes will wave over the true home of our people. To America, brethren, to America. So for a moment in your mind, identify the sentence or phrase that you think highlights a pull factor. Give you just a moment to identify that. If you said no distinction of race or faith, you were correct. That was pulling, right? Remember that the great American, or the melting pot that Israel Zangwill wrote was about the fact that this is a country free of any ethnic or religious divisions, which they were being legally punished for in their home country. So that was absolutely a pull, okay? So what do you identify as push factors that would be pushing these Russians out of their home and into immigrating to America? Okay, if you identify the brutalities and ignominies to which we are subjected in this, our birthplace, you'd be correct, right? Because that is what's happening in the home country and encouraging them to leave. All right. So again, I hope you find this as a helpful activity for identifying the push and pull factors some of the push and pull factors encouraging, in that particular case, Russian Jews to leave Russia. Now, it is important to note that while many Jews did immigrate to America, many also chose to stay in their home country. So what would be some of the reasons for that? Not wanting to leave behind their friends, their family, their home, right? So maybe also that fear of assimilation. We talked about assimilation a little bit earlier, and that there are some pros to it and there are some cons, right? That fear of losing traditions, their identity, and also simply just being unfamiliar with a new country, and the fear and anxiety that that might bring about. The uncertainty over whether life in the United States really would be any better or worth the cost of such a big change, right? Were they skeptical of this profession, of this land of golden opportunity? Were they skeptical? Was it too good to be true, right? Maybe that was some of the thoughts that were taking place. And it was an extremely costly venture. So it might have been just cost prohibitive for some of these individuals to leave their home country. Now, given the idealized way that America and the immigrant experience, for that matter, was being portrayed at the time, I want to pause and ask some questions that I think are very relevant and very important, which is, did Jews, or Jewish immigrants, I should say, experience racism in the United States during this influx of immigration, 1880 to 1924? And were they considered white at the time? Now, generally speaking, when Jews faced explicitly racist discrimination in the United States in 1880 to 1924, it was really social rather than legal, okay? Jewish immigrants faced discrimination in American society because of their ethnicity, as you know, along with these racist theories that deemed Jews to be inferior. Those were very commonplace at the time, and very much what was the sentiments back in Europe, and one of the reasons they were leaving their home countries. Now, even though official documents would record Jewish immigrants' race as Hebrew, they were generally, you know, included amongst white people in law. So they were, you know, given access to all of the civic rights of that group, including the right to naturalize. So what you're actually seeing on this screen, the image on this screen, is Albert Einstein's declaration of intention to become a United States citizen. And what you might be able to see there highlighted in yellow is that his race was listed as Hebrew. And to be clear, right, there is no such race. The notion of Jews being a race stems from an anti-Semitic claim, and you can learn more about that in our History of European Anti-Semitism resources and workshop. And also, I think it's notable to mention that both during this period and after, explicitly racist laws variably barred Asian, Native American, Black, and other people of color from many civic rights, sometimes including naturalization, which these Jewish immigrants didn't necessarily face. Now, as you can guess, for most Jews that immigrated to America, and most immigrants in general, their lives were not quite as perfect as had been portrayed. So to understand what life would have been like for these Jewish immigrants, his daily life would have been like, we developed a student engagement activity that focuses on analyzing some really interesting primary sources. Now, before we take a look at the activity and some of the sources, I want to point out that during the period of 1892 through 1924, a vast majority of what was estimated to be, I think, 3 million Eastern European Jews coming to the United States, about like I was saying, the vast majority of them came through Ellis Island, and most of them remained in New York City, right? Due to the fact that maybe they had a presence of family there, that there was an availability to work, and that the cost of continuing westward was simply too much for them to be able to bear and to move forward. So for this reason, the primary sources that we use in this activity deals primarily with Jews in and around New York City. And many of the primary sources come from the Tenement Museum, which is based in Manhattan. Okay, so the activity actually highlights 4 categories or aspects of life specific to Jewish immigrants during the time period under study. Labor, right? What jobs did Jewish immigrants have? Housing. Where did Jewish immigrants live? Religious practice. How did Jews' religious practice change? And culture. What cultural practice did Jewish immigrants take on? Now, we present this activity as a jigsaw activity for your students, and you can learn more about that in the lesson plan. So I'm just going to highlight some of the things that you'll find in that activity. So for the category of labor, now, according to most estimates, more than half of Eastern European Jewish immigrants worked in manual occupations, primarily the garment industry. And census data from across the country indicates that despite the concentration in these manual labor fields, some 90% of these immigrants were literate, which compared to about 79% of literate individuals and other populations of Eastern European immigrants. Now, following what we learned about the social anti-Semitism replacing legal anti-Semitism in America, Jews still had trouble entering many fields outside of manual labor in a country where the legal barriers to employment were now being replaced by prejudice and exploitation. Sweatshops were very common, where you would see entire families working for very long hours for very little pay, maybe in factories like you see on the image on the left, but oftentimes in their small apartment, which also served as the family's living space, which you see on the image there on the right-hand side. So let's talk a little bit about housing. So the housing for immigrants of all backgrounds was really abysmal in New York City. And by 1900, a full 2/3 of the city's population resided in tenement houses. They were poorly lit and ventilated buildings. They would house up to 12 people in these very cramped apartments that were no more than 300 or 400 square feet. So, maybe have your students visualize a small hotel room as an entire living space for a family of upwards of 12 people. If you have the opportunity to corner off 300 to 400 square feet and have 12 students do some sort of manual activity in that space, would be an incredible visual, right, for them to understand this type of experience. Now, often, right, these were the only options for immigrants who, in many cases, have really exploited the last of their financial resources getting to America. And these tenement apartments were really originally built for single family dwelling and built on these 25 by 100 foot lots, and they were divided to fit as many apartments as possible to accommodate for this influx of immigration in the late 19th century. If you've ever been to New York City and have toured the Tenement Museum and seen any of these tenements, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, let's talk about religious practice. So like many immigrant communities, this wave of Jewish immigrants had to balance the pressures and the necessities of assimilation, trying to maintain their values and religious practices, all while trying to fit into the American culture. So many of the Eastern European Jews who arrived in America during this period of time were often religiously observant, and they mostly spoke Yiddish, which was a historical language of Ashkenazi Jews, and it's kind of a combination of German and Hebrew. Now, one of the challenges that these immigrants faced was whether or not to keep Shabbat, right, or the Sabbath. Jewish religious law states that one can't work from sundown on Friday evening through Saturday evening. So upholding this practice of observing Shabbat was really challenging because the refusal to work on Saturdays would mean that one wouldn't be able to hold down a job at all and would therefore be imperiling themselves as well as their families who were depending on their earnings. Now, in addition to that kind of choice that these individuals had to make, over their observance of their religious practices or earning a living for their family, there was this also kind of an internal prejudice that was taking place amongst Jews who viewed other Jews who assimilated too much into American culture. So the image that you see here is the cover of a song called Boychik Up to Date, which a boychik is another word for boy in Yiddish. And it shows this boy who had become so Americanized that his Jewishness was no longer outwardly apparent. And he seems refined and an example of someone who has made it and really has immersed himself into American culture and society. But the song lyrics are highly critical of this Wojciech, and through him also very critical of the American environment that created him. And the song, there's a recording of the song by a folk bluesy band that you can listen to as well. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about culture. Jewish immigrants found ways of maintaining their cultural identity in America, but also helped shape various aspects of American culture as we now know it. What you see on the slide on the left there highlights Yiddish theater and how it became a very important institution in New York. Many of the global, really, entertainers and musicians from this era, like George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, who I mentioned earlier, they grew up in this Yiddish theater district. Their musical contributions are really an important part of American musical history. You can find their works in the Great American Songbook. Now, in addition to the arts that Jews were providing as a cultural addition to American society, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that they had no other outlet. They were barred from many different, clubs and things like that. And also the entertainment industry was viewed as not pristine, right? And so it allowed, where a large sector of the population was not interested in being part of it, allowed an opening for these Jewish immigrants to have this sort of opportunity. So what you'll all see on the right is how some American companies were able to kind of capitalize on this influx of new immigrants. So Times, for example, was advertising that their products were kosher and would meet the dietary laws and rules of these new immigrants. And in turn, right, many aspects of Jewish culture were adopted by the general public. For example, Yiddish words, right? Klutz, nosh, schlep. Those are all terms that have become part of the American vernacular, along with the bagel, right? Which was actually brought over from Poland by Polish Jewish immigrants. So now that we reviewed what daily life was like, I want to go back and ask you what happened to Jewish immigration. This is the chart that we analyzed earlier in the session. And what we learned on previous slides, despite the hardships of assimilation and starting this new life in a foreign country, Jewish immigrants created a very vibrant and successful community. So what happened, to cause this big drop-off in the mid-1920s for Jewish immigration? And it was touched on earlier. I think it was Laura that mentioned it. It was the 1924 Immigration Act, also sometimes called the Johnson-Reed Act. So as Jewish immigration population to the United States grew, so did backlash against this melting pot of cultures. And that's when the United States government created this federal law, the 1924 Immigration Act. And this law aimed to return the United States ethnic makeup to what it had been in 1890, when the new immigrant arrivals were predominantly German and Irish. So quotas were set at 2% of the population of the United States residents, with heritage from each of the specific country of origin as represented on the 1890 census. So I want to put that into some context for you. If there had been 1,000 Jews living in the United States in 1890, the quota would have been 2% of that 1,000, right? So think about that impact. So the law aimed to exclude Eastern European Jews as well as Southern Italian Catholics, which were the two groups that made up the bulk of new immigrant arrivals since 1880. Now, many of the arguments put forth supporting the 1924 law were explicitly racist and xenophobic. On the screen is an excerpt from a speech to Congress that was given by Senator Ellison Durant Smith of South Carolina. Now, for the sake of time, we're not going to read this out loud, and I do encourage you to take a look at it in the session's resources. But in short, what Durant is saying here is that a typical American is not an immigrant, but a person of pure, unadulterated Anglo-Saxon stock, okay? And that is a direct quote. He goes on to say that if America is to preserve its splendid stock, it should shut the door of immigration in order to preserve or to breed pure American citizens. And I will tell you that this law passed with 6 dissenting votes. Oh, 6 dissenting votes. Okay, so I can only imagine what your students might say when they learn about that. Now, as a result, we're about to start wrapping up here, but as a result of this law, it dramatically reduced the number of immigrants to the United States and Jewish immigration in particular. So the restriction on legal immigration led to an increase in the number of undocumented Jewish as well as other immigrants. Now, most tragically, of course, this law prevented millions of Holocaust refugees from gaining refuge in the United States before, during, and after World War II. Now, estimates vary. Somewhere between 180,000 and 220,000 European refugees immigrated to the United States between 1933 and 1945. The United States did accept more refugees fleeing Nazi persecution than any other country in the world, but the United States immigration quotas that were set forth for European countries were so small. And Eastern European Jews had almost no hope, really, of immigrating. And the vast majority of them were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Now, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum created an incredible timeline which visually represents how the United States immigration law affected people hoping to escape Nazi Germany and enter the United States. So it shows how many people were able to leave Europe and how many remained on the waiting list, and how immigration to the United States changed over time. It's a really neat interactive timeline and that I've linked in the session's resources for you. Now, to further illustrate the impact of immigration restriction in the early 1920s and the ultimate impact of the 1924 Immigration Act, I want to show you this political cartoon that comes from a Yiddish, was a satirical newspaper, if you will. It's called Der Boyer Kundes, which meant the big prankster or the big stick. Now, it was printed in August 5th of 1921, and it shows a Jewish immigrant from Poland. Okay, well, actually, it shows a Jewish immigrant, right? Which you can probably tell. Now, before I reveal the translation, okay, think about some of the things you notice about this image, right? What are some things that you notice? Go ahead and add those things to the chat box. What are the things that you're observing right away when you look at this? Share your thoughts in the chat box. What do you see when you look at that image? You see maybe a poor looking man. Oh yeah, you see the knives pointed upward. Yep, he does. He looks poor. Almost his face looks drawn, right? You can see he's almost in a rush, as you can see the billowing smoke behind him. There's no place for him to step. Exactly. And that, let me reveal some of the translations here. That's exactly what that says, Lauren, right? There's no place to set one's foot down. And we know that on his belt, that is indicating that he is a Jewish refugee. And those are the countries that would not allow him to enter their country as he was trying to flee Nazi Germany's persecution. So as we wrap up our conversation today, we've seen that Jews faced many similar challenges to other immigrant groups, but they also had their own unique struggles. Their legacies really have shaped the way we understand the larger story of immigration and the contributions that immigrants have made to American society. And to that point, I want to end our conversation this evening with some more words from Emma Lazarus. And she says, until we are all free, we are none of us free. And I think in many ways, those words really continue to ring true today. So I want to thank you all so much for joining me this evening and for your participation in our Mentimeter and in our conversations. I'm going to share a link with you in the chat box, or you can grab the QR code either way. But this is for the session's resources that will include pretty much everything I covered in our session tonight, videos, the musical recordings, the primary sources, all those things will be included in the session's resources. And lastly, I'm going to ask a favor of you because your feedback is integral to ensuring that we at ICS are creating curricula and resources that are supporting what you're doing and what your needs are, because that's really our ultimate goal, is to be able to support you. So if you could take just another moment of your time before you move on to the next thing you're going to be doing this evening, is take just a few moments to complete that evaluation. We would really appreciate your feedback. And the last thing I have to say before I turn it back over to Dr. Kenna is, if you are social media users, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We'd love to have you as part of our learning community, which you now all are because you joined us in this session. So again, thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of the virtual conference. And if you're attending the conference in person, enjoy that as well. It's always an amazing opportunity for learning and collaboration.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to end the recording.